Hello and welcome to the Dissect Connect podcast. I'm your host, Mike Wade. This is the podcast where we explore population health issues impacting your community. Dissect Connect is a service of New River Valley Community Services and the Montgomery County Prevention Partners. Welcome back to the Dissect Connect podcast. You're listening to episode number 34. It's hard for me to believe in many ways, but this week actually marks the 6-month point that I have had the privilege of serving as your host for this podcast. With that in mind, I thought I'd take an opportunity to do sort of a 6-month checkup, if you will. When I took over for Nicole Cothe as host back in March, our country was just beginning to feel the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Fast forward to early September 2020, and now almost 200,000 lives have been lost to a disease that, quite frankly, we still don't completely understand. Plus, there have been some recent estimates/warnings that those numbers could actually double by the end of the year. It's unfortunate, if not downright shameful, that the COVID-19 pandemic has become a source of political fodder. I don't care where you stand politically. I really don't. But the number of deaths that have been attributed to this disease are truly staggering. This is something that we all have to take seriously. And that includes following the recommended guidelines of social distancing, wearing a mask when you're in public, and washing your hands. I mean, it's pretty basic stuff. The debates and the back and forth around COVID-19 is a rabbit hole that I could go down quite easily, but there are enough, or some might say way too many, voices that are already weighing in on this issue. So I'll leave that right there for now. Since I began hosting this podcast, I've also celebrated my 20th anniversary at New River Valley Community Services. And I have to say this has been one of the most rewarding things I've done in my career. And that's not because I like the sound of my voice. I actually really don't. It's because I've had the opportunity to meet some extraordinary people through this platform. Keep in mind that when I first started working at NRVCS, I was still sending faxes and actually mailing press releases to local media outlets. So things have definitely changed. Whether it's colleagues I've known for years or guests that we've had on from across the state or around the country, I've learned a great deal in the short amount of time that I've been doing this podcast. And my hope is that you, the listener, have also found these conversations to be informative and enlightening, at least on some level. When we first developed the concept for this podcast, we knew we wanted to focus on population health issues. But it wasn't much of a game plan beyond that, if I'm being perfectly honest. We obviously tend to lean toward focusing on issues related to behavioral health, but at the same time, we have to acknowledge that mental health and substance use disorders can't be isolated and put into a box. That's why we've spent some time over the last 6 months talking about social injustice, poverty, domestic violence, and issues around sexual orientation, to name a few. Hosting and producing this podcast has been a bit of a challenge. Before she left, Nicole gave me a crash course on how to use the recording and editing software. And at the time, the plan was to have people come into our office and just sit down next to me in front of the microphone and record these interviews in person. Well, toss that out the window thanks to COVID-19. In fact, since I became host, all of my interviews have been conducted through the computer screen, using either WebEx or Zoom. Something else that I had to learn through a self-study crash course. I suppose there is a silver lining there. Without the access to technology, I wouldn't have been able to interview Beth Macy from her home in Roanoke, or do an interview with representatives from the American Association of Suicidology, one in Chicago and one in Washington, D.C. at the same time without Zoom. So not only can you teach an old dog new tricks, those tricks can actually come in handy. Producing a weekly podcast does take some planning. And so I've been working on upcoming episodes that will be published in the coming weeks. Planned topics include hepatitis C, hospice care and end-of-life issues, as well as peer support services, breast cancer, and the impact of miscarriage. But this podcast is really for you. So if you are a regular or occasional listener, I invite you to share your feedback, suggestions, or questions, and you can email me directly at mwade@nrvcs.org. And I'll be sure to include that in the show notes. Just write podcast in the subject line and get in touch with me. Of course, I wouldn't be doing my job as a podcast host if I didn't encourage you to like, share, download, and subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already done so. And if you feel so compelled, please share our podcast with your friends, co-workers, family members, or anyone you know who enjoys listening to podcasts. You're listening to this episode now because you found us on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Spotify, or iTunes, and I am truly grateful that you have taken the time to do so. So again, let me know what you're interested in. What topics do you want to explore? What do you want to learn more about? What concerns you? What is it that you think other people should know about? Don't be shy. Send me an email. I would love to hear from you. In wrapping up this episode, I just want to remind you to take care of yourself. Again, this COVID-19 pandemic stuff, we've got to take it seriously. Wear a mask, distance yourself from others physically, but stay connected socially and emotionally. You need that right now. We all need that right now. And do your part to not only protect yourself, but protect those around you. And since we're entering the fall, health officials are already recommending that we get the flu vaccine to help avoid potential complications associated with the pandemic. So be sure to do that, please. It's also important that we continue to eat well, exercise whenever we can, and get plenty of rest. These are difficult times, for many reasons, and paying attention to our own health and the overall wellness of our community has never been more important. So thank you again for being a listener. Take care of yourselves, and I'll talk to you next week. Dissect Connect is sponsored by Teen Connections, a leadership program through Planned Parenthood South Atlantic that empowers youth with the facts about sexual health and the skills to build stronger, healthier relationships. It's free, totally virtual, and you can earn $100 when you graduate as a Teen Connections peer educator in your community. Join a Teen Connections program from home today. For more information, be sure to check out the show notes from today's episode. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Dissect and Connect podcast. To learn more about Montgomery County Prevention Partners, our New River Valley Community Services, be sure to check us out on Facebook or visit nrvcs.org/podcast.